I recently found myself in possession of these 3 blocks of fermented soybeans, or Meju as they're called here in South Korea. These are the main ingredient in making doenjang, a Korean fermented soybean paste that is one of the foundations of Korean cooking. But of course, modern day doenjang isn't really made using Meju these days, so I'm going to attempt to make my own homemade doenjang the traditional way here in South Korea. And I've attempted this before a few years back when I lived in London, and while that batch of doenjang did work out fairly well, I think I can make an even better batch now. This all started last week when I went on a drive with my parents here on the island of Geoje in South Korea where I live. That's when we drove past Geoje Meju, a traditional Korean producer of fermented soybean paste and soy sauce. And I'd driven past this place multiple times before and seen the sign by the side of the road, and always told myself I'd go back and check it out at some point. Well, today was that day, and the timing could not have been better. As we pulled up, no one was home, but we gave the phone number a call and a man answered saying he would be there in a minute. We told him I wanted to buy some Meju because I wanted to make my own doenjang, and he told us just to pick whatever we wanted. We still took his recommendation on which blocks to use for soybean paste, and he picked out 3 and packed them up for us. While we were there, we also got a quick tour and a showcase of how the soybean blocks are made. This place only uses Korean soybeans harvested in the same year, which are cleaned and sorted to remove any bad beans or stones, then soaked and cooked before being mashed up and formed into these blocks. Those blocks are then dried before being stuffed into bags, then covered in rice straw and blankets in this room, which has a heated floor.
아저씨가 괜찮대.
Oh wow.
이렇게 어이구 이것도 많이도 싸놨다.
The blocks are left in here for about 3 days as it provides the perfect environment for the yeast and molds in the rice straw to inoculate into the soybean blocks. And after inoculation, these blocks are hung up in a dry, airy place, just like the inside of this greenhouse, in order to dry more and mature.
사람들은 그 간장을 많이 구우려면 좀 새콤.
Outside the greenhouse, he showed us some of these huge earthenware pots containing some of the aging doenjang and soy sauce he also produces. And you can tell how old some of these batches are, as each stone on the lid of one of these pots represents 1 year of aging. Now these blocks that I just bought had been hanging for over a month now, and should be good for making into doenjang. We even bought a huge 30-kilogram bag of 10-year-old aged salt from him as well, as he said it was the best salt for making doenjang. And just before we drove off, he also left us with a free sample of his doenjang, which should be useful as a comparison for my finished doenjang.
짜지 예.
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 맛있어요.
약간
딱 만들어 먹을
예,
때.
예. 물을 많이 타면은 짜. 예.
Salty. Yeah. Since I won't be able to use these straight away, he recommended that I hang these up until I use them, because it's not a good idea to just leave these in like a sort of closed container. So I'm going to hang these up for now. Hopefully that holds. These ones are conveniently tied together, so I can just go over that, hang these up one above the other. The other nice thing about the place that we just went to is that they gave me the charcoal, chilies, and bamboo sticks. It's like everything I need to make doenjang, and I've got the containers to make it. So it's been a few days since I bought these Meju blocks, and I'm finally able to take these and move on to the next steps to make doenjang. They seem to have done fine hanging up here in my little greenhouse, and while I'm in here, I also grabbed some of the 10-year aged sea salt since I was storing it in here as well. The first thing I need to do with these blocks is to give them a rinse and scrub to remove any straw bits and white mold growth on the outside. Now it's important not to let these blocks soak in the water, but instead rinse them. Then you're supposed to let them dry out again in direct sun, but unluckily for me, the sun had already disappeared behind the house, so I just left them out in the shade. You see, the cool thing about buying the Meju blocks from here was that I was also given the other ingredients needed to make doenjang, like this charcoal, some dried chilies, and these bamboo sticks that will help keep everything submerged. He even handed me this brochure that outlines the process, but the only thing about using the directions in this brochure is that it uses very traditional Korean measurements and language, which I have no idea what they mean. I even asked my mother for help, but even she wasn't familiar with many of the terminology used. So instead, I did some research online and have figured out a recipe that I think will produce a nice, not so salty fermented soybean paste. While the Meju blocks are outside drying out, I need to sanitize my fermentation vessel. I'm going to be using a Korean earthenware pot called a hangari, This one is a special one, which was a gift from Tina from Doobie Doobab, and it was made by one of South Korea's master hungary makers. To sanitize this, I'm going to turn this upside down on a pot of boiling water to steam sanitize for 10 to 15 minutes. I'm also going to weigh out my water and salt to make the brine which the Meju blocks will ferment in. This brine will eventually turn into soup soy sauce as well. For each block of Meju, I'm going to use about 1.8 liters of filtered water, which I'm going to add 15% of that water's weight in salt. So in total, I'll have about 5.4 liters of water and 810 grams of salt, which I've dissolved into the water, then ran through a cheesecloth to remove any little particles that may have been on the salt. By this point, the hungary has cooled down, and I'm actually going to go one step further in sanitizing by spraying down the inside with rubbing alcohol and then wiping it down. Now all that's left to do is to start putting this all together. I went out and I bought a few food grade cotton bags, which I've washed, and now I'm going to boil to sanitize them. I'm going to be using these to put the Meju into, so it's not just free floating in the brine. So the Meju blocks are mostly dry now again, but they're too big to fit in the hole of my hungary. Really, I should have a larger hungary, but I have to make do with what I have. So I'm going to break up the Meju blocks into quarters, which actually gives us a peek inside them. And I was quite surprised at how moist they still were inside. And you can see that some of these are a little more heavily inoculated than the others. At this point, I was just trying to figure out how this was all going to fit into the cloth bags. I managed to fit most of the Meju into this one hungary, but I was still left with about 1 block's worth that didn't fit. But later I made another batch of lower salt concentration water to ferment the blocks in to see if I can make an even less salty doenjang. I'll add the salt water to the hungary until the Meju is just about covered, then use the bamboo to hold everything down, which I had to cut because these were cut to fit a much bigger hungary pot than mine. The dried chili and the charcoal make up the finishing touches on this before I cover with a heavy cheesecloth and tie up using string. Now this isn't the best string to use, but I'll change this out at a later date. I'm going to place this back into my greenhouse, which I've kind of decided will be my sort of outdoor fermentation area. Something that a lot of traditional Korean houses have, although not usually inside of a greenhouse. And this will sit there for about 3 months before I check on it again, but until then I'm going to leave this closed and fight the urge to open this up and check on it.